Hi everyone, welcome to Weston's Financial Literacy Club's online webinar.
We're so excited to have you all here tonight as we dive into the foundations of successful entrepreneurship, specifically what it means to start your own venture, how to start spot opportunities, and how to begin building something of your own. My name is Amy,
And my name is Mary.
and we will be moderating tonight's webinar.
For anyone interested in becoming a successful entrepreneur, it is vital to understand the foundations. Whether you're brand new to entrepreneurship or just looking to learn more, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're incredibly honored to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Peter Bauer. Mr. Bauer brings decades of experience as an entrepreneur, as he is the co-founder and former CEO of the cybersecurity company Mimecast.
Also, before we get started, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. We'll have a Q&A session at the end where you'll have the chance to just ask questions directly.
I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker, Peter Bauer. Thank you for being here tonight, and now we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Hmm, Appreciate you bringing me on the show. You read an important heading like Foundations of Successful Entrepreneurship, and you immediately wonder, well, I only know my story, so I'm going to share things from personal experience, and I hope so. I think they translate generally, but I wouldn't categorize this as being the gospel on how to be a successful entrepreneur, but it's certainly, what I've experienced and what I've been through. It was interesting um, when you're going to talk to folks from who are in high school. It sort of takes you back. You think, what where was I? Where did my entrepreneurship path start, and how far back did it go, and how was I feeling about all of this stuff back in high school? And I really think that a lot of the seeds for entrepreneurship do start with what's going on at high school. I would say that in my businesses, um, many people that I was at high school with have worked with me, have worked for me, have been people that I've known from high school days that I've ended up co-founding companies with. So the networking and the relationships and the trust and the reputation that you build at high school, I mean, it's all can be a little bit clumsy. Whoever you were in 10th grade doesn't necessarily matter a great deal later in life as you go through, different evolutions of your character. But many of those friendships, many of those relationships will be things that will be long-term assets to you in business later on. So I would pay attention to that. I think if I think back to me of high school age. I grew up in South Africa, which may seem like a long way away. I don't know if you folks have been to South Africa. I would recommend it. Cape Town's a beautiful place. So if you have an opportunity, definitely take it up. But I went to a very nice high school in South Africa, a boys only school, with lots of great facilities and plenty of affluent kids at the school. I was not one of those affluent kids. My father was a high school teacher in the government system, and he raised us as a single dad. And I guess growing up with a lot of kids that were more affluent than us, um, I I wouldn't say I had any kind of dysfunctional envy, but I was certainly envious of what was like to have all the cool things that they had, vacation homes and parents with nice cars and the latest sneakers and all the nice things that that the richer kids had. But we had enough. But I was interested in how do I get ahead? How do I do something different? Um, and I noticed that the kids where the parents owned companies or were owners in companies, um, that sort of intrigued me because they tended to have a financial success profile associated with that. And obviously there's selection bias there. I'm only seeing the ones where it's worked. I'm not seeing the kids whose parents' businesses all failed completely. So, but it definitely made me think that building a business and owning a business was probably a good financial path or could be a good financial path. At the same time, um, the way I thought I'd get there, my experience in high school was not that I wanted to sit in the classroom much. I really didn't enjoy classroom learning. And I've no doubt there's probably like at least half of your classmates who put their hands up and say, yeah, exactly. Like, what are we doing with these books and all this stuff? And bear in mind, in those days, we didn't have infinite sources of information and knowledge like we do today. We actually did have to learn things and sort of remember them if we wanted to know them. Nowadays, that's maybe less necessary. You just need to know, what you want to know, and you can find it out, and you can learn on the fly. And with AI, that's sort of even taken to the next level. We don't have to search for information. We can merely ask for answers, and we can get with some reasonable degree of accuracy, good results back. But I didn't love learning, without, I guess, context or without application. Like, why did no one could ever say why we needed, teachers didn't seem to take the trouble to say, like, here's why we're learning this stuff. This is where it fits in. It's going to help you understand this and solve these problems and participate in these ways. It was like, there was this kind of magical assumption that we all wanted to know more facts, and we all wanted to know more facts about whatever it is, biology or geography, and that somehow we were solving that. This was therefore, like a foregone conclusion that we would apply our mental effort and our time to sort of getting into these things because, I don't know, we needed the grades, or the grades meant we could go to a nice university, or whatever the trodden path was. But frankly, I didn't really feel like that was the environment I was going to thrive in. But not in a, well, let me give up and just be kind of some sort of street bum. But it was, I want to find a path to be successful sort of on my terms. And so I was very focused on school and many of the non-classroom things. So whether it was debating clubs, or we didn't have this wonderful financial literacy club thing. I wish we had. I probably would have been right in there. But debating and drama and some sports and like things where you're learning teamwork, and you're kind of really getting to express yourselves and participate in things outside of the traditional curriculum. Um, so I didn't get good grades. I could have. I'm not academically incapable. I'm just academically unmotivated, I guess. Unless I really want to know something and I'm interested in it. And I'm probably easily distracted. So what I learned is actually to enjoy boredom. And I guess that's maybe one of the challenges, we have today. Because if I think about a lot of my creativity and creative tensions that I felt in high school, and things that made me want to develop entrepreneurial traits and skills, those were fed and developed in times of boredom, where I maybe nothing to do but go walk around outside, or go explore the neighborhood, or I don't know, climb a tree, or walk into the forest, or um, phone a friend and find out that like they're not answering the phone. And so I'd sort of sit there and think about what could I do next. So like boredom was actually quite an important thing. And I guess, you know, today boredom's not it's not so fashionable. I mean, people do talk about it, but we have so many ways to, let's say, distract ourselves, to tune ourselves out of boredom, to, consume distractions, if you like. And I feel like that's, even for my own kids, I wish them more boredom, because I think that is it's the crucible of creative thinking, and kind of connecting you to possibilities, if you like. But I learned, I guess, kind of the things that made me feel alive. So what made me feel alive was like having interesting problems to solve, like building something, that sort of energetic feeling when you and, some friends are building like a sandcastle on the beach, that like, hey, this is cool. I mean, it sounds really silly and juvenile, but like making a sandcastle is a great proxy for like building a business in a sense, because you mucking in, you're making stuff. People are expressing themselves. They're finding some seagull feather and sticking it in here, and some shells, and it's simplistic, but it like at the end of the day, that's what businesses, teams of business people are doing. They're bringing things they've found and thought of, and ideas they have, and they're modeling them out, and the teams sort of giving feedback and deciding what stays and what goes. And then every now and again, some sort of inconvenient wave washes over the patch where you were building your sandcastle, and you've got to like rebuild some more of it somewhere else. So it's like, but there's an energy there. And I like that example because it connects us with our inner child, and it's accessible, and often business can be thought of as some much more high-minded thing. But it is also about the teamwork and the people. And for me, I found I felt alive when I had an opportunity to go outdoors as well. And so, even taking from that and realizing the value in business of a walking meeting, um, walking outside in the outdoors and thinking about how you solve problems in that, how you collaborate, how you communicate better with each other. And so the one thing I learned is that um, I actually really like business. Like, aside from anything, people think about entrepreneurship as, well, we got to have this business idea, or we're doing this or we're doing that. But I think entrepreneurs, what they do is going to be very consequential in terms of what the success of it is. But there's got to be this underlying idea that, no, I really like business. I like deals. I like building teams. I like you enjoy that sport of it, and you get energy from participating in it. And while I'm sure there are plenty of people who are like, don't get energy from that, maybe get energy from other things. They love planting trees, or they love making music, or they love coming up, figuring out new algorithms and mathematical combinations of things. And it's not that they don't have any place in business. They have great places in business, but the principal, the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial team needs to be people who actually do really like the game and the sport of business. So sort of recognizing this, being in high school and thinking, this is my sort of makeup, and having had the benefit of boredom to give me the time to do the introspection and think about where I wanted to go. I was raised by, a father who has, I think, 6 or 7 academic degrees, including a PhD. My older sister was on a path to become an actuary, which is a fairly academic, intellectual pursuit. And there was me sort of in high school thinking, I don't really want to go to university because I've spent 12 years in a classroom, and maybe another 4 in another classroom isn't for me. But I knew I wanted to learn how to build a business. So I did go and study some marketing and business management through, like a private little sort of classes where you could get some minor certificate qualification in stuff. But within 6 months of that, I was really itching to want to be learning how to build a business. And I figured the best way to learn how to build a business is to actually build a business. So I had an opportunity to be part of founding a little company, a distribution company that was focused on providing schools in Cape Town with their school supplies. And this was a market opportunity that had opened up because um, schools in Cape Town had been government run, were not allowed during apartheid to admit non-white students. However, if they made a certain change to their kind of structure, they could have the freedom to admit students of any ethnicity. And so one of the consequences of that was they could no longer simply get their supplies from the government. So that created a problem for them. They wanted to admit whichever students they wanted, but then they had certain disadvantages. And so we created a little company which basically went to the schools and said, well, give us the order forms that you would have filled in for all the stuff you want, paintbrushes and floor polish and exercise books and chalk, in the old days, like whiteboard pens today. All I mean, there are just hundreds of things. And then we built a company basically to go and help them get all of that stuff on time for the school year. And it was fascinating. I did that for a few years. And I really learned there, some of the really interesting basics around buying things, selling things, building a little team, customer service, sales. It was fascinating. I'm in a small little company. I think there was five employees at peak, and I learned about co-founding. I learned about, a business partner, and my business partner, who was sort of the lead in the business in founding the business, but then left it to me really to do all the running operation of the business. He was a finance guy. Um, I learned a lot about working with people. And to be honest, the guy I started that business with was a particularly awkward guy who was quite maybe not the easiest person to work with. And I knew that. And rather than complain about that, although ultimately that did result after some years in our relationship dissolving, I embraced that because I thought, frankly, if this guy, with all of his skills, he was a smart guy and he had good experience and skills, if he had all those skills and experience and he was, the second coming of Dale Carnegie, then there's no way on God's earth I would have had an opportunity as a kind of, 19-year-old kid to start a business with this guy. So, if I could get the benefit of his skills, but still be a good partner to someone who probably wasn't that good at partnerships. That was my gap, and so ran at that. And then ultimately, we built a nice little business. And then some things changed in his world, and he wanted to take the business in a different direction. And I kind of got elbowed out of it. And so found myself at the tender age of 21, having built something, but not being able to be part of it anymore. And that was tough. That sort of pushed me into a spot where I didn't really know what I was gonna do. And so I stepped back a little bit, took some time out, and I went and traveled around the US and the UK for about 6 months. Worked on a summer camp over here, went around on Amtrak, visited various US cities. And in that time, really was trying to think about what's my next move entrepreneurially. And I'd heard about this new thing. This is now 1995, this new fandangled thing called the internet, which I think you'll know what it is, but but there was also magazines that were being sold in all the train stations that were talking, like technology magazines. Kept mentioning this internet, so I'd get some magazines, and on my train rides, I'd read them. And I figured when I get back to South Africa, I want to learn about this in much more detail, and because this looks like it could be a good business opportunity. So ultimately, got back to South Africa, and then decided I want to figure it out. So I did some training as a system engineer, a Microsoft system engineer, which were small, kind of very industry focused certification courses, but allowed me to know what the big vendors were doing in the space. So rather than studying kind of classic computer science and doing a much more comprehensive degree there, I needed really the technology to be demystified. And then I got a job working for a small system integrator, basically being the tech support guy for one of their clients, which happened to be the South African breweries, which I'm not here to promote the enjoyment of working at a brewery to high school kids, but it's a pretty good place to work. If you're 21, 22 and you're a tech guy, it's a fascinating environment. There's things being made, there's a factory, there's distribution, there's corporate functions, there's a lot of IT. So I really got to see a lot of really interesting application of tech in business. But I had a friend who I'd known from school days who had studied computer science, and he and I were talking a lot about where technology was going and what was this internet thing. And anyway, he and I and another guy decided to found a little software consultancy business, which we called Fab Technology, which was the an acronym for our last names, the B in Fab being Bauer. And so we created a nice little company, and that was a great journey in the late 90s. I could probably tell you a lot of stories about the joys and pains of being a really tiny startup in Cape Town. But needless to say, we within about 18 months of founding that company, we'd sold it to a larger public company for, millions of dollars, and found ourselves, as 24, 25-year-olds, with much more money than, we'd ever thought we would at that age. Um, and some experience at what it took to build a tech company. But I remember going to a talk by a private equity guy in Cape Town, and this was I think early 2000s, and he said something that really sort of put chills down my spine. He said, and he was talking about this whole the dot-com boom. I mean, we've got this AI boom thing going on now, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, these companies that were launching these internet businesses there was a lot of money, investment money, and people taking companies public, and valuations were ridiculously high, and the businesses weren't necessarily all particularly sound, but there were people making money hand over fist, and he said this thing. He said, "None so useless as the prematurely wealthy," and that made me really think, geez, what is that? And I'd recognize perhaps in myself that too much success early on had maybe changed the way I thought about things a little bit. Being young and affluent, even through what you might have said is your own doing. It's one thing, you see people who just, maybe have their parents' money or their grandparents' money, and struggle with who they are in that context. And it all sort of plays out as if they're entitled or something. In some cases, it can be a little dysfunctional. But when you've made that money yourself, the temptation to believe that you're sort of better than you are is strong. And I think that it made me really want to go push to the next level and go, okay, hang on, I don't want to be complacent. I don't want to top out here. If I'm too impressed with myself, I'm 25. Life is very long. What can I do? And so I wanted to, when I left Fab Technology, after working for the new owners for a few years, I really wanted to go work in a international setting. And so I figured if I could take South African software and go and sell it in Europe and go set up sales channels, that could be quite an interesting opportunity. Now, that ties back a little bit to what I did in 1995, where I traveled around. So I'd gotten some international exposure. I'd learned about sort of the world outside of the borders of South Africa. And so I felt I wanted to go to London and do that. And so we moved. And by that stage, I was married to my wife, and we had one kid and we had one on the way. So, but we made this bold move, and could fund it ourselves because, having sold the previous company. And we found that within a few months, me and a guy that I was working with, we founded this little company which we called Pangea Labs, which was, helping South African software expand. We just found that it wasn't a great business model because the profit margins were not strong, where we didn't have control of our destiny in terms of the product, and we were getting feedback from international customers and then trying to translate that back to people in a distant country who didn't necessarily understand or believe the same things. And so we really felt like we were headed for mediocrity with that business. But the bright side of having got into that is I met another South African called Neil Murray, who became my co-founder in the business that we ultimately did start within a few months of having moved over to the UK, which is called Mimecast. And I think you shared a little bit in the profile. It's sort of in front of us here, some of that journey. And, Mimecast is, a 23-year-old company now, almost in January. And I led it for 21 years. And that was an incredible experience and tremendous learning on that journey. From being two people to being, over 2,000 people, from having no clients, and no technology to having, over 40,000 clients, and from having funded it ourselves and through customers to bringing on investors and venture capital and growth equity, and then taking the company public on NASDAQ, and leading it as a public company for 6.5 years, through to then being taken private by a big financial sponsor about 3 years ago. A huge amount of learning, and really the first two businesses that I built, although each one of those at the time felt like the thing, I recognize now that the learnings that I took from those, let's say, smaller, I don't know, the warm-up laps, if you like, as long as one was willing to show up again and go and play at the next league, those learnings were very valuable if applied. So I think that one can look at Mimecast, and probably any success. Luck is a necessary component. Certainly the absence of bad luck is a necessary component, or the sufficient absence of bad luck. But it's not enough, usually. You've got to get some other things really, really right, especially over an enduring period with consistent growth over time. So that whole process really, able to benefit and do things structurally and deliberately constructing Mimecast in a number of ways that really worked to help assure success. So I'm gonna pause there for a second, because that's a little bit of my background and history. And I don't know if we want to move to some questions, or if you want me to talk about some other specific themes as
Yeah,
well.
so we have some, before we open to our Q&A, we have prepared some frequently asked questions. So if we wanted to go into that real quick.
Our first question for you is, what were some of the most important financial lessons you learned while raising capital for Mimecast?
Yeah, that is a great question, because I'm really blessed nowadays. I get to work with a number of smaller companies, and smaller companies that are growing traditionally are dependent on some investor money. They're not yet generating the profits, or they're not yet getting the revenues to support all of their growth and their product development aspirations or their expansion goals. So, and the number one thing that kills companies is not that they've bad ideas or they don't have good businesses, but the number one thing is they run out of cash. So, you can see companies all the time that just run out of money, and then they can't continue because there's a mismatch of investment capital that they've not been able to find, and for whatever reason. So what I learned was super valuable was always to have multiple sources of investment capital available to us. And the best investment capital is the money that customers pay you for a thing, whatever that is, the early version of your product. Because that money is not just valuable in terms of helping pay the bills and keep the lights on. It's valuable in terms of true validation as well. So you definitely want customers to be funding, your business, if that's a possibility at all. But I learned something valuable when Mimecast started to raise external capital from initially angel investors. And I remember we were in the UK, and we were looking to raise, I think it was $500,000 or pounds at the time. And we had an advisor working with us, and he had a bunch of contacts and meetings that he'd set up for us to go and do our little pitch. And we didn't know how it would go. And I remember the very first one we went into, and we met this investor whose name was Robert. And he was a very wealthy guy. I think he'd made his money through real estate in the UK. And we pitched it to him. And he said, I really do like the sound of it. And he knew Andrew, our advisor, and he said, great, you're looking for 500K. Um, I'm happy to give it to you. And I was like, yes, that's amazing, you know. And I was literally about to reach across the table and shake his hand and say, that's fantastic. When Andrew said, Robert, thank you very much. We're flattered that you would want to provide our entire round to us. That is super exciting, but we're actually only accepting 50,000 per investor at this stage because we want to build out a base of investors for the company because we know that this is going to be a long journey and we want to be able to have people that we can come back to in time as we've delivered things and have support for this company's growth path. So, you know, Robert was like, okay, well, I mean, count me in for that then. And that proved to be such an important point because if you are if you're able to do that, if you have the means of building multiple deep-pocketed investors that you can go to as part of your growth journey, that is super valuable. I would say it's also quite unusual to be able to do that. And normally people get dependent on a small number of investors. Um, and the key thing then is to make sure that you've really done the work to get the best investors that you can have available. But you know, really, it is almost a full-time job for a founder CEO to be ensuring that they've got access to investment dollars and that they're building that network and curating that network of where their capital can come from.
All right, perfect. That's so interesting. Thank you. Our next question we have for you is, what are some common mistakes in early team formations that you see first-time entrepreneurs make? And what are some things that you can avoid, ways that you can avoid these mistakes?
This is an interesting question because, you know, often entrepreneurs, they've got to, well, maybe let me start with this statement. I don't believe in founding a company. I believe in co-founding. Um, I think a team of at least two, and you don't want 5 or 6 people co-founding a company. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's very complicated. And you'll sort of understand more of that as I describe what you're looking for in a co-founder. A co-founding team, the right co-founding team is going to be like 3 times stronger than an individual founder, just from a resilience point of view and that partnership. But it's complex. When you're choosing a co-founder, you want to have an, an overlap of skills, but not the same skills. So, for example, I don't know, let's make this up. Let's say you're a business person and you want to go into the restaurant business. Well, don't go find another business person to be your co-founder. Perhaps go and find someone who's a great chef that knows that part of the game. And they're like the product person. They know about, you know, that stuff. Or maybe you need to find um, a consumer brand person who's like really going to take care of that aspect of it. But you want different skills, but overlapping a little bit, so that you have some commonality, but that you're going to take care of different things. But most importantly, you want to have the same values and you want to agree on the same objective. And what I mean by values is a commitment to wanting to work together in the same way. And that could be, you know, the way you communicate, your openness, your honesty with each other, your your attitudes towards how you want to treat staff, your attitudes towards how you work with suppliers, your sense of commitment to, you know, doing things the right way or doing the right thing, whatever those things are. So if you find that there's a distance between you and a co-founder on fundamental issues of kind of character, and that's not to say that that there are, I mean, yes, I do have views that there are right and wrong ways of doing things, but there are also like many flavors of different. Some people are going to be very commercially aggressive, and other people might be less so and more consensus driven. But there are those stylistic value things that you want to resonate well with each other's energy, because it's not just for you, it's for everyone who comes to work for the company. So it's like, if mom and dad are completely out of kilter with each other, it's really confusing for the kids, just to sort of put it that way. And it's kind of the same in business. If you have two co-founders who amplify each other's positive energies, that is, so much more of uh, an advantage for success. And then I guess you also want to agree when you selecting a co-founder, um, and often you meet potential co-founders through networking or through just friendships or life, or other, you put yourself out there, you meet people, and you sort of find this commonality naturally. So it's there, but you do want to test it and make sure through open conversation that you actually have a sense of the same objectives. With Mimecast, it was a very, very long journey, and we'll put co-founders, journeys like these put co-founders under a lot of pressure together, and things that can drive one apart. You want to have a sense of what you're both willing to sign up for. How much financial hardship are you willing to endure together? How do your respective partners or families feel about that? You want to find alignment, or at least understand where each other comes out on those things. Um, what are the needs that you have financially? How much uncertainty are you able to deal with? My co-founder in Mimecast, I was really fortunate that he and I just had such an honest, open, aligned relationship. And I drew inspiration from simple things he would say, like, success will bring many options. It was like, he wasn't needy for like me telling him how it was going to work out in infinite detail, but we would just agree like success will bring many options. So let's get back to work. He'd have another one, which is action kills fear. So we could all sit and hand wring and be anxious about anything that was going on, and there's certainly with plenty of things to be worried about. But we would agree on that fundamental is that, well, like, but when we get to work and we start doing and making the calls, or getting out and seeing the people, or taking the next step forward, the fear would go down and the odds of success would go up. So, aligning on values, aligning on objectives, constantly communicating. You want to choose people to work with that you actually like hanging out with. I hear people saying, I don't need friends at work. I'm not looking for friends. It's business and all that stuff. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe that does work for some people, but the intense amount of communication that has to go on to bring a business to life, to let it kind of claw its way into existence, is a sort of labor of love for a bunch of people. And those people should enjoy showing up for each other. They should enjoy being stuck in a room together on a whiteboard. They should enjoy, walking the streets and thrashing out issues. They should trust each other. Like there's got to be the joy of the game and doing it together, not like a sense of dread of like and that you will find that you hire people where you figure out you really don't like spending time with them, rather than making things feel like they could get better. you know, you've hired somebody who only makes it feel like things are going to be worse. Um, you know, and they're going to help make it worse. So, like, you'll encounter those things, and you want to curate that team and those team choices very carefully. And part of that is also deciding who you want to be as an entrepreneur, how you showing up. What is your commitment to making this great? And quite potentially even communicating what that commitment is that you're making to yourself, and communicating that to your team and your co-founder, and asking them to hold you accountable to that, and saying it's okay if you see me get cynical or negative, or you don't feel I'm locked in, like, you raise that with me. I need you to raise that with me. Keep me honest here. And so it's that relationship is like probably one of the biggest indicators of, second after running out of cash is those founding relationships falling apart that can compromise the the potential of a venture. What else you got?
Our last frequently asked question is, how do you distinguish between a challenging phase worth pushing through and a sign that you might need to change or adjust an idea?
Yeah, again, I think a really good question, because maybe start off by accepting that almost everything about starting and founding and building a company is going to be hard. So, like, you're very seldom going to find the easy bit. Periodically, with some luck, you might. I mean, at Mimecast, we had a situation where uh, a mid-sized competitor of ours was bought by a bigger company, and then, a year later, that bigger company decided that they didn't really want to be in that business, and they shut it down. And so we were literally, for some period of months, standing by the fax machine. I don't know if you know what a fax machine is. You can ask ChatGPT. I'm, I'm pulling your leg. But we were literally watching the orders literally just roll in, like consistently, and that felt pretty good. Um, but for the most part, things are going to feel hard. And so, how do you have the judgment to know, is this, when you say push through, you never want to miss the signal that comes from adversity. So if something is hard, you do want to go, well, why is it hard? Is it just because this is going to take time? Or is it like we're not listening to our customers enough on this issue? Or we haven't spent enough time in design? Or an assumption we've made, like the difficulty we're encountering is actually giving us a signal that one of the assumptions we've made about some aspect of this is not right. So you want to make sure you're listening as carefully as possible to what does the friction you're encountering mean. But absolutely, there are points where you get to a certain point and says, No, we got to change." And for me, that was, one of the most notable points for me was with that Pangea Labs business, where I'd gone in. I'd moved my family to the UK. I'd signed up to sell and promote another company's products. It was literally waking up every day doing something in a foreign country, committed to a particular business model. And within a few weeks, it dawned on me that this was not going to be the ingredients here, and what we'd set out with our aspirations was not going to get us to a place that we actually wanted to be. And that was a function of understanding gross margin, an understanding of how much investment was going to go in, understanding the level of support that we would need, but we're not getting from our counterparties in South Africa. Um, and and so we shut that down. And also, we were probably able to see that more clearly because we had another alternative idea we wanted to move to. So all of that takes time, and it's sort of the fog of war. But sometimes you do have to shut down the thing you were doing and go stare into the abyss and embrace the boredom and go learn and orientate to see where you need to be better. Um, Find a new product, come up with a new concept. So yeah, your relationship with adversity is an interesting one. It's a great teacher. And sometimes it's saying, listen harder, tweak more, incrementally evolve. Sometimes it's saying, like, change lanes, and soon, because this one's not heading anywhere good. So I don't have a perfect answer, but it is the perfect question.
Thank you so much for answering those FAQs and for sharing your insights. Now we would love to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat for Mr. Bauer to answer.
And it looks like the first one sent is, what inspired you to start your first company and why choose this specific product or service?
Yeah, so I think what I said in some of the opening comments there was I was out of high school and I was in a marketing management course. So I was learning a little bit about accounting. I was learning a little bit about statistics. I was learning about consumer behavior. I was learning sort of the practice of marketing. There was a little course in economics. So I was getting a general sort of tour of, if you took everything you would learn in an MBA and you took the easiest 5% of it, that's what I was getting kind of exposed to in a little 1 year course, which was great. But I was really interested in how do I go use that and apply that, you know? Um, and and I guess when you get out of high school and you go and you start learning in some, let's say, track that's meant to teach you how to do a job in particular, you're quite keen to figure out, okay, well, what is theory here and how do I use this in practice? And certainly I was anxious to do that. So I was always looking to see what could I do. And even in high school, I was the kid that sort of printed T-shirts and sort of try to sell them to, my church youth group and then, was buying and selling stuff. Um So when my dad actually introduced me to someone that was starting a business, or when he met this guy who he'd known through his work and said he's starting a business, my dad said, well, can my son come and talk to you because he's interested in business and maybe you need somebody that can help you do stuff. I don't know, carry boxes or whatever. So I went to see this guy, but I grabbed it with both hands because I looked at it. And so I didn't come up with the idea. He did, that my business partner. But I recognized immediately this was a place where I could like learn and do and make something of the theory I was learning.
Great, thank you so much for sharing.
All right, the next question it looks like is, how did you get into cybersecurity when you didn't have much experience in that department in the beginning?
Yeah, perfect one. If one becomes a student of a space, it's going to take time to learn anything. But how do you demystify something as quickly as possible? How do you learn really, really quickly? And maybe my focus has always been on how do I sort of understand something without having to be an expert? And then how do I find people that have deeper expertise that I could work with? And the reality with Mimecast was I had actually spent a fair amount of time studying email and corporate messaging because the company sort of built itself on email as a well, email security is what the company is very well known for. But I had spent time and I'd gone and learned that technology. So I wasn't, let's say, blagging it. I built some of the very first email systems that had gone into corporates in South Africa. I'd gotten the certifications. I learned, I wouldn't say I was overcommitted into deep expertise, but I knew, a bit more than enough to be dangerous in the space and to be able to speak with authority and understand the area, understand the problem set. I guess that's the most important thing is, do you know enough about an area to understand the problem? Many people think that a business is about an idea. You have this idea to start this business, and it's about the thing that you're going to make. And people talk about the startup as being, you've now a startup. I actually believe there is a much under indexed space or time or phase which precedes that, which is called the think up. And the think up is actually where the person that ultimately decides to launch the startup was really coming to understand their version one view on the problem that exists. Because anything you make has got to be a response to a problem. And if you can't characterize the problem that exists in the absence of your product, or that exists generally, whether your product sort of is there or not, you, you don't really know what you're getting into. So, and that's, uh, I could talk for a long time about that point. When we founded Mimecast, we could have written 10 pages on the problems that were existing for customers around email and risk. But I'm not just saying like a glib 5 sentence or 5 word phrase saying, there isn't enough, vanilla flavored milkshake in this neighborhood. It's like, okay, so there isn't enough vanilla flavored milkshake in this neighborhood. And again, follow me on this. I'm making it up. It's all probably nonsense, but that is because like people are just drinking Diet Coke and they don't have an alternative. And the problem of us not having this healthy vanilla milkshake is people only drinking Diet Coke, and then they're frying their brains with too much fake sweetener and caffeine. And so like silly example, but it's really about indulging and deeply understanding the problem, but not just the problem in its first concentric circle. Like, what are the implications of that problem? And then what are the implications of those implications? And why is that bad? And how are people trying to solve that problem today that's causing more challenges or more cost or more complexity? Like, you really want to be a student of problems before you're a student of an idea for a startup. Um, because that's really where the home truth of what makes you meaningful, and often companies will lose even once they've built something. They all become focused on the selling of the thing that they've made, and they lose a connection to why they exist and what is the problem set. And they go searching for purpose in all kinds of ways that are tangential to the core reason why they exist in the first place. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Without time and a whiteboard and a whole lot more examples to really nail down that point, is if you want to be an entrepreneur, become a miner of problems, like really mine problems and understand the challenges in a space, because that's where your big opportunities ultimately lie and your unique opportunities lie. Oh,
Um,
I see
our
something
next
about college degrees here.
Yes. Our next question is, despite the deflation of the value of a college degree, the majority of the spots on jobs and internships are mostly only available for college students. Do you think that college is a necessity or a step in one's life that could impede their career as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite questions. And I think, I have 3 kids, two graduated and one's in college. And so I've come to appreciate, how valuable college actually can be in terms of, the things you get exposed to and people you meet and all of the learnings. But I think it is also worth appreciating the cost of it, um, both in terms of time, years spent doing that versus what something else might be, um, and also the financial cost of it. But on balance, I think tertiary education is a useful thing. I say I didn't go to college. I went part-time for 1 year, and then I finished a 3-year marketing diploma over 10 years. I went to night classes and then I bought the books. And so this isn't about not learning. It's about picking the best and most efficient way for you to learn what you think you want to know about and what you want to understand, and exposing yourself to knowledge and opportunity. And that was my choice in the pre-internet era, certainly the pre-AI era. And I mean, you folks are about to graduate high school, and you'll be, you know, the last high schoolers that ever went into high school before AI. Like, that's cool. And it's really interesting. But like, you started high school before there was, let's say, mainstream AI. Um, I started my career just at the emergence of the internet, and it presented enormous opportunities for, you know, new ways of solving problems. I guess that's the point, is you can use these technologies to solve problems in interesting ways. But I really do understand the challenge is that wrongly, I think, um, companies have simply been using a college degree as a shortcut to evaluate candidates. To go, okay, well, here's this thing you got to jump over, and if you can jump over it, then you can come and talk to us. And it's called a 4-year college degree. And if you finish it, it tells us we don't have to do as much work evaluating you, because probably other people did work evaluating you, and you round your way through that thing, and then you probably also know some other things. So there's some attributes about you that we can assume if you've been through this. It's just really like laziness, but kind of that's how the world works. They work on the cover of the book before the contents. So I don't say that college is wrong for anybody, but if you feel it's wrong for you, now is better. Not There's never been a better, more liberating time to go, you know what? I'm going to explore alternatives, and there are incredible alternatives. I mean, frankly, if I was financially constrained and I wanted tertiary education now, and there's a whole social aspect to college, which I definitely don't want to underappreciate. And I got to experience that because all my friends went to university, became lawyers and doctors and accountants. And I lived in the same city as them and got to do all the cool student-like things with them anyway. I just didn't have to go in the classroom. I was delivering toilet paper to schools in Cape Town by day. Um, but there are so many ways you can get an education online and design your own courseware. And if you were going to spend money on university, even if you cut that in half and you spent that on courses that can teach you negotiation, or courses that can teach you specific craft. Like, I took the money I got from selling my school supply business, I took that money, and it was very expensive. And I spent it to do the Microsoft technical training. It was almost the price of a year at university, like public university in South Africa, to do these 6 courses where I learned like about email service, like a 1 week course. It was like insanely expensive, but I did it because I wanted to accelerate learning and I wanted to demystify. And I understood the value of time, because by the time I got to Mimecast, and I was a 29-year-old kid, essentially, living in a foreign country, starting a business, I had had a decade of company building experience um, already. And I wouldn't have had that if I'd done 4 years at university and then followed the natural path of that, which is, I don't know, one of the big five or KPMG or, whoever the names were at the time. There's different names now. It said, well, come and do an internship now and, learn about corporate life, and then, get a job as an associate or a assistant or whatever the ladder is that they lay out for you. And that may be perfectly fine for people that want to do it that way. But in the context of a conversation like this is about where the breakout opportunities from the norm. And if you want a breakout opportunity from the norm, think carefully before you commit 4 years to something that might preclude you. It may be the best thing you ever do to go to college, or, and they are, I mean, Babson, for example, which is where my son went, has great entrepreneurship training, great foundation. There are many fine universities that teach you lots of valuable things around finance and all of that stuff. But But I would say for pure entrepreneurship, for company building, for company starting, those things are helpful, but they are not required. But you will need to know how to work with people that can bring those gifts. And I was very fortunate to have amazing teammates and the ability to recruit and relate to really talented people to help build the company. When we sold Mimecast for, 5 point whatever billion dollars, and I got hold of my dad and told him, he said to me, well, it's a shame you didn't own all the shares. He was joking, by the way. He's always pulling my leg about that. I mean, he couldn't care if we sold it for, $5 or $5 billion, frankly. But he said, well, it's a shame you didn't own all the shares. And it made me realize, well, that's the point, is if you want to build something that, at least on a relative scale, is quite successful in its headline number, it's going to take a village. There are going to be a lot of people involved. And being the point entrepreneur that founds and leads the company, that is one role. It's one I happen to have chosen for myself. But there are plenty of supporting acts in those stories, which are, as important and critical and more important collectively. And you can design your career to do that. And college educations are quite fine preparation grounds to be part of an entrepreneurial journey, even if you're not the one holding the compass and pooping in your trousers while you do while you do it. Um,
Yeah, I thank you so much. That was so interesting. It looks like another question we have is what was the biggest obstacle you faced in the early stages and how did you overcome it?
um, I think with each business, it's different, and I think just committing to the act of founding, like I used to say when our company was bigger and we'd have, whatever problems we'd have, teams would be struggling with something affecting growth or some strategic decisions or, you know, cultural issues or whatever it was that they were struggling with. And I'm sure I annoyed them by saying this, but I would be, you know, the biggest problem this company ever faced was right at founding. Because whatever problem you think you have now, imagine a world where you have no product, no customers, no team, no money, um, no brand recognition, and very little clarity about what the future may hold. And yet, we managed to create what we've managed to create. And it wasn't easy and it wasn't fast, but we overcame that problem. And if we can overcome the founding problem, then surely we can overcome any of the subsequent problems, as long as we don't underestimate the effort required to do it. So that's like take it seriously and really think and act as a team. But think about it in the context of this is an organization that solved its founding problem. And to some extent, that is the obstacle is you have this combination of problems that you have to solve for. And that's why I really like this concept of the think up, because the think up is where you really are like getting all of those things worked out as best you can. And then you're ready. You're busting to go. You've worked out at least what you think your initial flying formation is. And you've managed to get the resources, if that's some money, some people, some customer conversations, some, raw materials, some space to work, whatever those combination of things are that you've got to get together. Um, but that's an exciting part, and that's the legendary stories you get to tell later, is based on overcoming that early stage kind of founding problem.
Our next question is, how did you identify and leverage revolutionary technologies throughout your career that have helped you run your business?
Yeah. So again, really key point is paying attention to what's changing and understanding what was and what is showing up now and how how technology might impact life. So I was fortunate when I first, as I mentioned, when I got into my career in technology, before there was internet, there was another architecture for delivering computing called client-server architecture, um, which is really means that some of the software sits on the person's computer and some of it sits at a machine way back then at the data center. And these two work in a, whereas the internet largely works where most of the work is done back at the computer in the cloud. And then what you're consuming on the front end is a much more lightweight sort of, it's through a browser, very lightweight, maybe a mobile app nowadays. But there's this clever machine way back then. And, when it was client server, there was a lot of clever stuff happening on your computer and you had to have, fans and things to cool it down. And then there was machines back, not in the cloud, actually, in the company's own computer room, if you like. So that was a different architecture. But that architecture also replaced, a previous architecture, which was like mainframe and mini computers. So I noticed when I first got into computing before the internet, client server was emerging. And I noticed how as those new technologies came in, some big companies that did it the old way became smaller companies, and some small companies that did it the new way became big companies. And that made me really appreciate the value of knowing what is shifting and the rate of what's shifting and being willing to place bets on emerging technologies because if you're on the right side of the technology evolution, you could go from being small to big. If you're on the wrong side of it, you could go from being big to small. And the reality is big companies have got much better at navigating this change. So if you follow Microsoft as an example, they almost missed the internet. They almost went from being they went from being a small company to a big company with client server, and they almost lost the game. And in the 97, 98, they almost missed the internet entirely. And that would have been we would remember them fondly as maybe, I don't know, maybe we'd still run Windows on computers or something, but they would be not, like one of the most valuable companies in the world. But they worked out just in time how to embrace it, but it was hugely disruptive to them as an organization to fully embrace it. They had to throw out or re-engineer so much software to embrace it. So companies nowadays know, and now you can see with AI, that's the next thing. And companies have learned almost to overreact to the emergence of a new technology. Who knows if they're overreacting because we don't really know where it goes, but there's an enormous hype around AI today and a lot of capital and investment going into it. I don't know if it's proportionate, but it does show that big companies are terrified of missing a wave. But there is a wave. But but the way you capitalize on these things is firstly really be aware, become a student of the subject matter and become a miner of the problems. And that's not like an afternoon's work. That's that becomes your hobby, your fascination, the thing you do is you really go think about and study. And access to information nowadays is not a problem. But your attention span to consume it and think about it, that's the constraint. So doom scrolling will rob you of that. But it's all there. Like those new technologies are arriving at a pace. And, I think especially for young people who don't have as many preconceived ideas about how stuff works because you're still discovering it and you've got like huge neuroplasticity and energy and you're trying to solve for things in long time frames. Not like me where your sort of career is, I don't know if it's peaked, hopefully not, but it's easier to think it as. You're going to just look at the world in new ways and embrace the new technologies.
All right, perfect. We have two more questions before we unfortunately have to cut for time. But if you were to recruit now, what aspect of a contestant will you value most and why?
Um, of a candidate, I guess. So recruiting people, I mean, yes, of course, expertise um, and experience are valuable things. But I think, and you scroll on LinkedIn if you're on LinkedIn and you get these cheesy, like Sam Altman sort of Wunderkind quotes. But I think he said it quite well. He said you should hire for values first, um, and like what somebody is committed to. And I would put in those things like um, there's this Patrick Lencioni thing, hungry, humble, and smart. They must really be hungry to learn. They must have the humility to take on new information and be good teammates. And then they must be smart. So there's a values thing there. Then the skills and the experience, those are those are important indicators that they've done a thing and maybe they'll have a fast start. But the rate at which the world's changing, and I guess this was Sam Altman's point, is you may hire them and in 6 weeks' time, things have shifted so meaningfully. What they need to do is like changed anyway. So you want the right person who's then going to figure out all the rest of the stuff and is going to like, okay, so we're not doing judo today, we're doing javelin. Okay, like let's do that. But is like ready to knuckle down and like learn and figure it out and has domain context that they can bring to bear. They're not raw, but yeah, that alignment. And it also comes back to I believe the outcomes in companies are strongly impacted by how people feel about their work. So when you look at a candidate, you say, how will being in a room with you make me feel about my work? And and frankly, how for you being in a room with me, how does that make you feel about your work? Because if there isn't an energy that's created and a desire to like, hey, let's meet again, let's go through this, like let's cook some stuff up here, then everything that's already hard is going to feel extra hard, as opposed to everything is really hard, but we feel a lightness and a curiosity and a determination that we could get this done. Like, let's try. Um, so who you allow in the door is such an important question from co-founding all the way through to early hires, and then ultimately it's not just about who you recruit, it's about who you kick off the team because you're going to learn things about each other or the business changes and it's not for everyone. And so, you know, what do you tolerate? How do you curate that team? One thing I realized with investors and as a CEO is often the CEO is like, they feel like they've got to be the smartest person. They've got to have the answers. They've got to, be able to keep investors happy or whatever it is. What I realized, and maybe a little bit too late, but fortunately just in time, is almost the only thing that investors are looking at a founder CEO for is can this person curate and lead a team of people that can capitalize on this opportunity? So the entrepreneur has shown the opportunity. They've created the prototype, they've created the initial entry, they've got the investor's attention. Now the investor knows that that individual is not the person who's going to be the smartest person in the room at all times. I mean, they might be quite smart, but that's the job is can they build a team and curate a team and lead a team that will capitalize on this opportunity. And that means hiring brilliant finance people and software people and sales people and marketing. So that's what they're looking for in that founder. And it's sort of worth knowing that because those are all skills that, aspiring entrepreneurs that listen to this can go and build. So that's the answer to the exam question from investors.
That's a really good point. Thank you so much for sharing. For our last question, Investors would take equity from the startups. How do you decide how much equity you can offer to the investors for certain funds received?
Yeah. So there's different ways, and you can approach this. In a very early stage, sometimes it's difficult to know, and Silicon Valley's come up with models. So there's a thing called a safe note, which is a subscription agreement for future equity, which is basically a way of sort of punting on knowing how much of the company an investor should get. Those are fine, probably to use once. I think you get companies which roll over safe note after safe note, and they create this unmanageable monster of putting off valuation, and then it creates other pressures. You get, you know, investments in other instruments like a convertible loan, which basically is saying, okay, we'll put, $1 million into the business now, and then we'll convert that in. We'll do it as a loan, but it'll convert to equity, in 2 years' time when this business is more developed and an investor comes in and can actually value it, and then we'll convert it to equity at some discount to what that investor is paying. And in the meantime, the loan will accrue some interest. I don't know, 10% interest every year. So in 2 years' time, it's worth whatever the compounding is, but like roughly 120% of what it was, and then there's a discount applied, so it buys more equity than the new investors' same money would, and you work it out that way. But I think like how the dilution works is almost less important than who you're raising the money from. If you can get the right investor, you'll work out terms with them and be very honest about what is the stage of this, like a really early startup, just to get some seed money. You definitely don't want to have the wrong investor giving you too little money for too much equity. I mean, that's the worst case. A great investor, and when I say a great investor, I mean someone who could also give you more money than what they're giving you. If they're giving you all the money they've got for this venture, like you all have to know that, because they're not going to be able to be supportive. That's why that example with Andrew and Robert that I mentioned earlier, leaving everyone wishing they could put in more is more valuable than taking everything they were willing to commit. Because then when you need the money, you got to go find people who don't yet know they want to put money in, and you got to convince them to. Whereas if you can make 10 phone calls and 8 people go, oh yeah, I was waiting for you to call. Thank you. Where do I send the check? That's a lot more empowering for your business. But I mean, you can read about different ways to value startups, and it's probably a lot more art than science, but there is sufficient science about it and precedent that you'll discover the right level. And sometimes it's about asking enough investors rather than charging out saying, we think we're worth X and you should get X for Y. You can phrase it by saying, look, we're trying to figure out what the right approach here is, and we have some points of view. However, how do you think about participation and value? So you can ask them to tell you, how they would think about it. But it's another important area of learning. Cool. Yeah, that's a complex technical question. It's an important one, but it's a complex one. So I don't want to oversimplify it with the wrong answer there.
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for your questions, and thank you, Mr. Bauer, for your insightful answers. We hope that you all found this webinar helpful and that you're walking away with some useful tips. A recording of this webinar will also be going out on our YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that. Also, if you would like to be automatically notified for any future webinars, please leave your email in the chat, and we will add you to a mailing list.
Also, if you guys have any further questions or want to continue this conversation, get involved, feel free to reach out to any of our Financial Literacy Club members.
Thank you again to Mr. Bauer for sharing your time and expertise with us, and thank you to everybody for being part of today's event.
We hope you all have a great night, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.